right, let's go. Let's just do this, man.
Okay, we're recording. Go ahead. So where we left off was we're talking about Plato's Apology, the Apology of Socrates, to be more precise. And where we left off, Socrates was addressing the accusations and the slander that was being, put against him. And where we left off was he had just essentially finished addressing what he had called the old accusations, the kind of the sort of this long collection and the history of how he came to get the reputation, which has been partly responsible for leading him to this place where now he's, facing a jury and a judge. And now what we're going to do is pivot and, as Socrates did, and focus on what he calls the new accusations, meaning that the specific accusations that are being brought to him by Miletus.
Right.
And so the two accusations were what? So he was being accused of corrupting the youth, primarily, and there's some modifiers there too. So when Miletus is saying, or the modifier is that he's teaching the youth to make the weaker argument the stronger.
He's being a sophist,
right? And frankly, what he was being accused of is essentially of teaching the youth to not respect authority. At least that's how it's being interpreted. And Socrates actually has some words that explain what actually is happening. And then the second accusation was that he is not he's not following the same gods as the city. So he's introducing new false gods, or he's not showing any allegiance to the gods of the city. And so what Socrates begins doing at this point is essentially unpacking. I try not to overuse that word, but he begins the process of unpacking and really disassembling the claims that Miletus has brought against him, right?
Yeah. All right. So that's where we had left off last time, and the charges that are brought against him, he actually talks about how that impiety is the one that leads to a harsher sentence, and between the two, and he talks about his, like you said, his reputation leading up to that point, and how, because his reputation has been set for a really long time, he's a very old man. He says it's there are two types of this reputation. One is this reputation that is what you see in front of you. Me walking around questioning people and harassing people while influencing a group of young men. But there's this long-standing reputation that I have, that people of power have known about me for a very long time. It's almost like an undercurrent in society, and it's very difficult for me to be able to defend myself in such a short period of time against both of those. But he says he's going to try his best. Nonetheless, what he says in the end essentially is that he is in fact someone who is a servant of the city, and that he does not, he's not impious. It does not that he doesn't believe in the gods. As a matter of fact, that he believes in justice and piety through justice, and that's the reason why he cannot be accused of impiety, because he's following what the gods told him. The gods told him, "Hey, Socrates, you are the wisest man, and the reason why you are the wisest is because you know that you do not know." And his job now is to make sure that he goes out and he wants to find someone who is wiser than him, but he keeps meeting people who are unwise. That is, people who do not know, but they go around telling people that they know. And even when someone confronts them and tells them, "Hey, do you in fact know?" and then they realize that they do not, they actually take offense to it. And that's the worst form of a person who does not know, but he pretends that he knows. And even when confronted with the fact that he does not know, is not willing to learn. And that is the God's work, he believes. So he believes he's actually pious. And then he is accused essentially, he's brought to court, and he gives a defense, and at the end of that, I think we came to this point where he basically loses the case. He ends up saying that he ends up losing the case, and but before he does that, he does something very peculiar. He actually, and we've discussed this before, he almost leads the jury to bring about this accusation against him. He is one of the best minds of his time, and he could have easily gotten out of this situation, but he does not. It's almost like he's playing his own game. And the line that actually talks about that essentially is when he says that he sets the jury up. He says, I'm here accused, but you won't find that I'm going to beg for a way out. I'm not going to bring my family and my kids in front of you and beg them and have them beg you to save my life. I'm not going to do that. And in a way that actually sets him up for a harsher sentence, because there are people in the crowd who have actually done that. He actually says it. There are people in this jury right now who have done this. They have tried to entreat the jury. And now when you see that I don't do it, you believe that I don't do it because I'm proud. But when you see me not do it, it actually makes you angry. And but instead of being angry, I would like you to understand why I'm not doing this. And the reason I'm not doing this is because I believe that a juror should not use his emotions to come up with a judgment. He or she should use his or her rational thought to come up with a sentence. That means understand justice. And if I'm wrong, and whether I have kids or whether I have, whatever I've done, whatever precedes me has got no bearing. If I have done wrong, I need to be punished for it. And if I try now to entreat the jury to get emotional, I'm actually going against justice. And since Socrates, I believe in justice, I think it's injustice to entreat.
Mm-hmm.
So that is one argument that he brings up. And then there is another argument that he brings up too, about why he should not fear any judgment. And that is the fact that he believes that no harm can be done to a good man.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk about that?
Yeah, it's a very, and that is sort of the pulsating central and really, when you think about it, shocking theme of the Apology, which is, and it's something that's elaborated on other readings of Plato, where he's talking about how Socrates rationalizes this idea of what virtue is, and the concept that it is better to suffer injustice than to do injustice. To say that is actually a pretty shocking thing to say, because I think most people under conventional understanding would say that, the person sitting in the tyrant's chair is actually better off, because what they're doing is they're pulling the levers, they're punishing people who don't satisfy them or please them. And it's the hapless, servile people who are at the whim of this tyrant, who are the ones that are suffering misfortune. But Socrates points out, and interestingly and compellingly, through purely rational ways, explains that no, there's this idea that you have a soul. And we should mention that this is something that we talk about, like, what do you think Socrates or the ancient Greeks meant by soul? Mm-hmm. And probably the best way to think of soul, at least in my mind, the way I conceptualize it as I'm reading this, I'm not really thinking of sort of the supernatural soul that you would encounter in sort of more religious texts. I think when they talk about soul, they talk about the state of your character, the state of your person, the state of your sense of self as it pertains to the nature of your thoughts and the values of your actions. or the impacts, the moral impacts of your actions. And if you could aggregate that into sort of yourself as the abstract, then that is the soul. And what Socrates is saying is that to know virtue allows you to pursue it. And the closer you get to virtue, the more you pursue it, the better you improve your soul. And in fact, at the end of this trial, after he gets his judgment, he passes his own judgment, really, on the jury and says, my soul is intact. I cannot be harmed. Then that's the rationale. That's the explanation of that sentence. That Socrates, with death sentence in hand, is walking out of that courtroom completely unharmed. Shocking. How is that possible? And it requires you to understand what the nature of virtue is. And so the apology, the reason it resonates through time, this is thousands of years old, is because this concept, and Plato wisely put this to paper so that people here in 2021 would be talking about this idea that it is better to suffer injustice than it is to do injustice, because that tyrant who's sitting in the chair, or the person you could think, not to be such a less inflammatory example would be the person who's sitting in the chair of the unexamined life, the person who's just following convention, the person who's just sort of listening to their friends and doing what they do, the person who's just sort of following the milestones and the narratives in life that have been laid ahead of them and not really contemplating the consequences of their decisions. You actually you're at risk, you're in peril, because you're not examining your soul. You're not examining what it means for you to live a good life. And so, and when you detract from that, you find that, and this is elaborated on in other readings, but I mean, think of the tyrant, to go back to the inflammatory example. Mm-hmm. Is a tyrant happy, or are they pleased with what they do? Because I think what's happening is that they've confused power for virtue. And so, with the power, the old saying, absolute power corrupts absolutely. Mm-hmm. Power corrupts. Mm-hmm. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. Mm-hmm. The reason it does is because power gets hungrier over time. Its power soaks the goodness out of the population. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? It soaks, essentially. It's the counter to virtue. Correct. Virtue is actually self regenerating. It takes one virtuous act to trigger virtue and inspire virtue in others, which is the power of virtue. So it's possible to reach a virtuous state without robbing it from other people. You cannot say the same thing about power.
And so what you're talking about is this line, this about this convention. This is a great point that you bring up. He says this, I didn't care about the things most people care about, mm-hmm. making money, right. managing an estate, or being a general, a popular leader, or holding some other political office, or joining the cabals and factions that come to exist in a city, but thought myself too decent in truth to engage in these things to survive.
Right.
Because engaging in these things, if I'm engaging in them, it was not going to benefit either you or myself. But instead, I went to each of you privately and tried to perform what I claimed to be the greatest benefaction. That's what I did. I tried to persuade each of you to care first not about any of his possessions, but about himself, and how he will become the best and wisest, and not primarily about the city's possessions, but about the city itself, and to care about all other things in the same way.
Yeah.
And that's what...
Absolutely, yeah. And to put it in more practical terms, I mean, I think Socrates in this dialogue points out several times the fact that he lives in poverty. He's not a rich person. He hasn't accumulated wealth. But he also hasn't ignored the influence of wealth or the appropriate role for wealth. I mean, he does say that there is wealth that can be achieved through virtue, but whether wealth or not arrives, that can't be the main concern of somebody who's trying to live the virtuous life. If it arrives, great. So it's not like he's sort of anti-wealth, but he has it in its appropriate place. But to go back to the accusation specifically of Miletus, Socrates he's planting the seeds of where he's going with all this. Because basically Socrates takes Miletus's claims and essentially puts them in a blender and throws them over his shoulder. He's like, this makes no sense. He says, Miletus, your claims are facetious and contradictory, and you're bringing me to trial for my life, at the risk of my life. but I'm ready to die. So what Socrates is saying in two short sentences is that your argument makes no sense, but I'm ready to die. So Socrates is almost sort of foreshadowing the fact that he's going to probably lose this case, not because, he says specifically, not because of Meletus, but because of the conventional thinking of everybody around him. So what Socrates does right from the get-go is that first claim, this idea that he corrupts the youth, he tears that apart pretty rapidly by using the example. Well, essentially, he questions Meletus and says, well, all right, well, if I'm ruining the youth, who's making them better? And Meletus says, well, we all are. Like the judge and the juries and all the Athenians. So Socrates is like, oh, so I'm the only one corrupting them. How much sense does that make? And so then he uses the analogy of the horse trainer, right? So the horse trainer improves the horse, but everybody else who wears the horse out, they're not really improving the horse, they're using the horse. And Socrates is saying that you're using the youth the same way. You don't really care about the youth. You're using the youth for your final gains to inflame this accusation against me. So he tears that first claim apart. And then the second one about the gods, he basically, there's an interesting capitulation in this because Meletus basically, he stumbles into a trap that Socrates sort of sets up for him, ironically, because Socrates says, so tell me about this claim that I'm not following the gods of Athens. And he's like, is that what you believe, or do you believe that I don't believe in any gods? And then Meletus says, I don't think you believe in any gods. And Socrates is shocked. He's like, how could this be? You just finished making the claim that I'm teaching about the wrong gods. And so he tears around that part. So anyway, so all this to say that fairly quickly after that, after essentially showing the easy logical flaws in Meletus's claims, he jumps immediately to the nature of his defense and the fact that he's ready to die, because he says he first briefly explains, and he elaborates it later, why it is that he does what he does. And you've discussed that very nicely, which is what he's trying to do is rouse in people, not only through examination of other people, but through himself, this idea of that should happen. We should examine one another internally, and we should examine ourselves externally, so that we're constantly making sure that, we understand what we're doing is the best possible good, and that we're doing our very best to avoid evil. And so, but then he uses the analogy of when he was a soldier at war. He said, for me to sort of say, well, okay, now I'm going to stop doing that, and I will, recant everything that I've done. That he says that would be very strange. It would be like a soldier walking away from their post. At this point, what he's saying is that it's almost like virtue is his commander now. Virtue is the general that he's listening to. And that what he's in is he's in essentially a war of hearts and minds. He's in a war against convention, because he sees that the evils and the problems that can come from just purely unexamined conventional thinking. And Euthyphro was just one piece of that. There's other examples of that too. So pretty early on in his defense, Socrates says, your argument's weak, but I'm ready to die. And he sort of hints at the fact that I probably will, but he explains why he's okay with that. Just shocking. Like the levels in this discussion, this idea of I'm not harmed and I'm ready to die. Fascinating.
So yeah, you're right. So this is a summary again of what exactly happens in this case. It's also a testament to the fact that he was playing this game. I feel that he was a person who would go up to each individual and then try to make private citizens understand what he was trying to tell them about wisdom and justice and temperance and courage. But now he has an opportunity to do this on a public scale. He talks about how one cannot talk about justice or bring about change in a public fashion, because you are at risk. Whenever you do that, you are at risk to go cross against the state and then be put to death for it. And so, and that's why he chose to be a private individual. But now he knows that his time is at an end, and this is the best possible way for him to get his views out there publicly. He was an old man at that time. And so he probably could see that this is probably the best thing that can actually happen to him. A lot more people that who would have not entertained him now have to sit and listen to him. Mm-hmm. And so uses this platform to talk about this. So, and so he his game is that he is being allowed now to speak unhindered to a large audience, and he knows all this is going to be recorded for posterity. And so he uses his eloquence to not fight for himself, to not plea and beg for himself, but in fact to make a plea for the sake of virtue. So that's what he's doing. So now coming back to the claim that he makes about how a good man cannot be harmed by others, right? And what you said there is key, that he does not fear death. And so how is it? How is it that he does not fear death? And he gives this excellent example. He says, Meletus actually says that he chooses a death penalty for Socrates. The jury, it says Socrates is guilty. Now, what should we do? Should we kill him? Should we send him to prison? So he talks about the fact that he doesn't fear death, because the jury says, okay, he's guilty, and Meletus says he should get the death penalty. But the other options are death penalty, imprisonment, fine, with imprisonment, just paying a fine, or going into exile, or obviously being acquitted. So he says, obviously, I would like to be acquitted for this, because I'm on this path of justice, and I would not choose injustice onto myself. I have made a case of how I should be acquitted, why I should be acquitted, and how I've been of service. I have not done anything for myself, none of those conventional things. I've actually spent time bettering the city and its people. And for that, for what my service is, I should be getting free meals. You guys should be taking care of me because I'm a poor man. He says, well, that's not going to happen, and he's saying all these things to enrage the people. I think this is a ploy on his part to get the death sentence. You see, he's by making these statements like this, that instead of suing me, you guys should be feeding me.
It's too bad that there's no documentation of how the crowd reacted, right?
Yeah, you don't see it.
You can imagine the judges and the jury sort of scoffing at the idea.
Especially the ones who are against him,
Right.
And he's goading them on. Mm-hmm. So then he says, all right, fine. You guys don't want to feed me? So then Meletus, this young man, is saying I should be put to death. That I don't know necessarily if that's a good thing or a bad thing. Who knows whether death is a good thing or a bad thing, right? As a matter of fact, if I was given a choice, I would choose death. He's actually kind of goading them, saying, give me death. And the reason he says that is because, say you imprison me. Who wants to live a life like that? Spending the rest of my years being told by someone to do this or that, right? I think imprisonment is worse than death. What about a fine? So I have nothing on me. Would you take a silver mina? I think I don't know how you pronounce it, which is nothing. And he says, that's the best that I can come up with anyway. So it might as well imprison me because I cannot pay the fine. And he says, then what about exile, Socrates? Why don't you just leave? And he says, that is the worst of it all, because you, my fellow Athenians, the people who I love, and I'm from this place, you cannot tolerate me. Mm-hmm. If you send me to another place, do you think those people who are strangers to me will be able to tolerate me? Because I'm going to do the same thing. Because a man should spend a man or woman should spend his or her life examining his or herself. Mm-hmm. That is, the examined life is worth living, and an unexamined life is not worth living.
Right.
And he or she should engage in discourse about virtue. That's what we should all be doing. So if you send me wherever I go, that's what I'll be doing. And those people get tired of me, and then they'll send me off to another place. And at this age, I cannot keep going from city to city, trying just to escape the wrath of the people and not engaging. So he says, then why should you not talk about this and just be quiet? He says, well, I'd rather die, rather than not be able to engage in discourse about virtue.
Right.
And
because he says that's the right. This is him just sort of closing the loop for what he had hinted at earlier. So
that's right.
He he uses the example of Achilles in that early defense against Meletus, which he says he did. Any decision that you make in life, the fear of death should not factor into that.
Correct.
You should fear vice, not death.
And that's the great point.
And so once he's planted that seed to the reader, his conclusion at the end, as sort of as drastic as it seems, makes complete rational sense. So in a way, there may be some Socratic irony and there may be a little bit of gamesmanship, but if you look at the soundness of the rationale that Socrates uses to say, I have no reason to fear death. In fact, to fear death would be very hubristic of me. Like that would be that is the ultimate form of ignorance, is to pretend I know what happens after death. So for him, it was a logical statement to say, well, I'm facing death. I don't know what it is. I don't have any reason. It's either nothing or it's what it's purported to be, and some sort of ethereal, immortal parlor where I can converse with other philosophers. And so then it's great. So he rationalizes his way into sort of the idea that it's either something good or something equivocal. The likelihood that it's something bad is not there. So again, so it's sort of like this. There's this rational fortitude behind everything he says and his decision making during the course of this. So, but I do think that he was sort of in a corner and he realized it. I think there may have been some gamesmanship, but I think at the very beginning he realized, yeah, this is because the frivolity of the case. Like he knew that it was like, this is such a weak case. You guys just want me out of here. And I think in his head, he sort of walked the audience through his rationale. And he got pieces of information from his, questioning of Miletus. And he got some feedback from the jury, obviously, right? The jury voted to put him to death. But, but the margin was not super big. There was, I can't remember by how many
30.
votes, right? 30 votes, right. And so, his idea is that, I know where this is headed. And so I'm essentially just going to sort of elaborate on what I know, what I've learned. And I'm going to not only express my commitment, why this is important in terms of everybody here around me who's listening, but I'm going to continue to follow my own principles, which is, again, to examine what I do and follow through with what he calls his daemon, which you could really consider his rational sense, his sense of wisdom, and he's going to follow that because that's what you should do. So in terms of consistency, he is the most consistent character in this dialogue. So
this is one way for us to think about how we should conduct ourselves in the setting of a crisis.
Yeah.
When there is when we are being accused of doing something, how do we then hold ourselves? He says the most important thing here is reputation. His reputation actually brought him in trouble. And what he's doing is he's maintaining his reputation throughout this whole process. So how does one do that? By not trying to entreat people. It's natural for us to do that. If you're in a position where we are blamed for something, either we try to accuse someone else, to take the blame off our shoulders, and if we cannot do that, then we try to entreat the person, say, just let me go, please, please understand my situation. I'll be in deep trouble if this were to happen, and we lose sight of the fact that what we are doing at that point is we are subjecting ourselves to villainy, to vice, and villainy is worse than death. And he says, this Pascal's wager. You've heard about Pascal's wager,
right? Yeah.
About the people use it for different situations. They talk about, do you believe in heaven? Or do you believe in God? You can always use Pascal's wager. But Pascal's wager comes from this, because the line that the little passage about death, when he talks about it, he says, what is the worst that can happen to you? Right? If you and me were put in a situation that we are accused of something, what is the worst that can happen? The worst that can happen is that you could lose your life, is what we tell each other, right? That's the worst. And most of the situations in life that are never going to come to pass. We're not going to be, put to death for some of these things. So that's going to happen, hopefully. But the other thing that we worry about essentially is to lose our reputation. But what is that reputation? It's the conventional reputation that we're worried about. We should be more concerned about our own soul. This rational thinking, this daimon that he talks about, is basically this introspective property, our own soul. And we are at risk for injuring that, causing injustice to ourselves. So what he's talking about is, I don't want to injure myself.
Right.
And that's why I don't want to just, agree to some frivolous thing that you guys are saying. But you are saying death. Death is no injury. And once he's put death out of from the injury box to maybe a nothing or maybe a good box, then how do you harm a person like that? So what he says about death is, either it is a blissful sleep, which is uninterrupted by dreams, the best state of unawareness, that even kings don't get that kind of sleep. It's either that. And if that's the case, then what's there to be worried about? There's no fear. or it is in fact spending eternity with other souls who've actually transcended to heaven. And he doesn't use the word heaven, but he says are in a place where you can actually discourse with them for eternity.
Mm-hmm.
And you can discourse with them and not be put to death. You cannot be accused for discoursing with them. I can ask folks who in the past who were accused just like me of wrongdoing, wrongly accused, and ask them about what they felt about their trials. Spend my time in that, and actually go on to do what I'm doing here, going up to people who currently convention believes were wise men and they died, and actually find out if they actually knew a thing or two or not, if they were in fact wise or not, because that kind of inquiry in this afterworld doesn't lead to death.
Mm-hmm.
I can do that for eternity. That actually is the best of is much better than what I have today in this current life. And that's similar to Pascal's wager, where they're like, well, if you believe in heaven and that doing good gets you to heaven, do good, because if you're wrong, there's nothing wrong there. Nothing's going to happen. There's no heaven. You're going to be in blissful sleep. That's death. But what if there is a heaven, and you didn't in fact do good deeds through your life? Then that's an eternity in hell. Are you ready to wager that there's an eternity of hell lying in front of you? And so it's similar to what Socrates says here.
Yeah. In my mind, Pascal's wager has more to do with, more specifically to the belief in God, which is,
But you see, it's a play on the words, right?
Right.
You could look at this paragraph and come up with that.
But there is some convergence there. I agree.
I feel like a lot of things that later on, philosophers have kind of come up with have been offshoots, just like the great conversation, right? It's an offshoot of Platonic thinking, and which is offshoot of Socratic thinking, which is an offshoot of Homeric thinking, and things like that. But
but yeah, specifically for the listener, the Pascal's wager is, I choose to believe in God, because if he doesn't exist, well then I'm not losing anything by believing in God. But if I believe in God and he turns out to be extant, and then I'm still okay. But so we've kind of covered the second half of this dialogue, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's
pretty much done at this point.
Yeah.
But again, goes to show that if you follow the story, the jury then chooses the death penalty for Socrates. And Socrates says, fine, I don't think that is necessarily a good or bad thing. And then
he accepts it.
He accepts it.
Right. He accepts it. And he really says
this is one thing that we should talk about.
Yeah.
He actually says that, I think that's why I believe that this was gamemanship, man, because he says, oh, you chose the death penalty. Well, this is going to come back and bite you guys, because you could have just let me go.
Right. I'm 70 years young.
I'm an old man. Death is at my doorstep. So he says, I'm an old man. You guys chose the death penalty, which is silly, because I'm an old man. Death was at my doorstep anyways. Mm-hmm. You could have just let me go and I would have died. And there would have been no black stain on you. But now what you've done is you've actually sentenced me to death. You're going to put me to death, and in front of these students of mine, who he doesn't call them students, but these people that I know, mm-hmm. and who I have restrained. I have actually restrained them from going up against the Constitution, against the city. And now once you put me to death, unjustly like this, I won't be around to temper their fury. And that's exactly what happens. Obviously this is Plato writing about Socrates, right? Mm-hmm. And Plato was in the crowd when Socrates was indicted. And so what he's saying is, Socrates is saying that once you put me to death, these students of mine, the people who actually look up to me, are going to be unleashed. And then you're actually making me immortal by putting me to death. You could have just let me die, and I would have been just one among the billions of people who have died and gone, and no one knows about them. But by putting me to death, you've actually made me immortal. And the reason why he is immortal is because of Plato. Plato goes on to write about, about the apology. The reason why we are discussing this today is because Socrates laid his life down by standing up for virtue.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting idea to contemplate whether, in the alternate universe where Socrates dies of old age, and Plato writes out the dialogues, would it carry the same weight? It's hard to say, but for that reason, that's why I think maybe Socrates sort of knew, and he saw this in a way as an opportunity. Meaning, but the thing is it's a hybrid. I don't think he planned this, but I think he followed his principles, and it was fortune or misfortune, depending on how you look at it. But fortune, he saw an opportunity to practice, to move everything that he elaborated during his discourses, all the principles that he helped formulate in his conversations with all of these collaborators on the dialogues. And here was this opportunity for him to actually move everything from just thoughts and words into action. And he did it. And so at the very least, it puts a very stark, bloodstained, but also very compelling and very eternal, intellectually speaking, exclamation point on everything that everything that was documented about his conversations.
Just think about it. Like he took his reputation as someone who was an irritant, a gadfly, to someone who is actually considered to be the father of, thought in a way. You see what I mean?
Yeah, I mean,
his reputation. He talks about, this is about my reputation, and by not entreating and by not doing these things, I'm going to uplift my reputation. As a matter of fact, you cannot harm me. He proves it by willfully accepting death. And that is why I say that this is a great way to actually look for someone to decide how to deal with a crisis. You just have to believe that if you believe in virtue, you believe in yourself, you do the right things, right? You cannot be harmed. It is very difficult to look at death as not a harm. Right. I see that. But look, this is an example.
But also to be mindful of the prevalent risk of unwittingly ending up in a self-harm situation, which is why he says daily, you should introspect about, virtue, the quality of your character. That's actually the most important thing that you can do in life. So, after he gets his verdict, he, leaves with probably the most profound last words, although they're not technically his last words, but his last public words that you'd probably find anywhere in philosophy or even literature, where he says, we go our separate ways, I to die and you to live, and only God knows which is better. So he, even in death, even in his acceptance of death, he essentially inhabited the uncertainty with the surety that the only thing that mattered was the soundness of his decision. What more could you ask for?
This is great. The apology.
So I think I've read the apology. This might be my 5th or 6th read through. And even this discussion, I think there's so many themes you can pull out of this. Like when you were talking about reputations, how people can, get rolled under slander, how difficult it is when you're unjustly accused of doing something, the risk involved with defending yourself, and how, politics can sometimes, often completely twist the good and useful things in our lives into things that end up being misconstrued or misinterpreted, and lead often to lost opportunities. We're reading about Socrates, but in a way, at a surface level, if you just read the events that happened objectively, it's tragic, right? This guy was put to death wrongly. This person was brilliant. This person had a lot more to share with the public. But in another way, this is precisely why we're talking about him, as you said. So it's
as a society, we need to do better in trying to keep an open mind about other thoughts. Socrates during his time was somebody that people would say was against the city states, against society, antisocial, in a way, creating a problem. And we see a lot of examples of that today in the world as well. And we want these people to go away. They wanted Socrates to go away back then, right? But there is something to be said about freedom of speech, about be able to say what's on your mind. And not there's no other Socrates, and they're very few and far in between. But by allowing everybody to express their opinion, whatever be that opinion, you could, and by paying attention to it and using your own rational thought to pick out what is good and what's not, that is in fact the way for society to get ahead. There's a very nice line in this. He says, if you imagine that by killing people, you'll prevent anyone from reproaching you for not living the right way, you're not thinking straight. Mm-hmm. What's best and easiest isn't to put down other people, but to prepare oneself to be the best one can. That's all we need to worry about. Mm-hmm. Whether we should mask or not, whether we should vaccinate or not, whether we should allow immigrants into the country. When we get into these kind of complex decisions, and discussions, we're very easy to start putting down other people. These people are stupid. People who don't, wear masks, or people who get vaccinated, or, people who support immigration. We create these factions. Which this person is, stupid. They don't understand what's going on. Rather than worrying about the other person or what their views are, just worry about making yourself the best human being one can. The justice towards yourself and others. Being courageous. Be ready to take on fear. Being moderate in your endeavors, in your life, and having the wisdom, the practical wisdom, going through life, wearing someone else's shoes for a day and seeing what their life looks like. Being the best one can, and not worrying about conventional reputation and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's, and that's why this dialogue is so compelling, because by that same, it's brilliant actually, because yes, you should not sort of subscribe to convention without examining it, is essentially his point. And so his inquisition of his fellow citizens, there is a protected space there that deserves protection, which is this idea of free speech. But Socrates would also point out that, okay, if you have an idea, well, let's test it. There needs to be a willingnness to test your ideas, mm-hmm. a willingness to test your own positions. And I think that's an important component of what he's talking about. So freedom of speech and freedom of choice is worth protecting and makes sense. But Socrates, I think, would also say, and those choices, you should be ready and willing to explain your rationale behind mm-hmm. the choices that you make. Mm-hmm. So, and if you have an opinion, you would do well to be ready to have it falsified for mm-hmm. you and embrace a better decision or a better truth or a better fact once you find it. So it's the examination process, right? Examine yourself, examine others. And the civilizations, the societies that I think can maintain that are the ones that are set for progress, and the ones that become inculcated into like cemented conventional ideas that are unfalsifiable, unchallengeable, and cannot be critiqued or examined in depth or in a meaningful way. That's a dangerous road.
Definitely. This was great.
Yeah.
Awesome.
All right, we'll leave it there.
All right.